Welcome back, Internet people. Today we're painting our nuthatch, and I've drawn it here on my paper using my Faber-Castell water-soluble pencil. This is an HB pencil. It dissolves in water as long as you do not get pigment on it first. If I make a mistake, I've got my little kneadable eraser here. Everybody needs one of these. Get it? See what I did there? I'm also going to be using some masking fluid today. This is a brand called CQR, just a generic kind of brand of masking fluid. It's pretty much all the same stuff. Important to use a brush you don't really care about. That one's been used quite a bit. It's got a fine point. I can put it on and stroke it across, not worry about the brush being damaged by it, because the masking fluid will wreck your brush at some point. So here I'm putting in the little specular highlight in the eyeball, carefully placing that on. That way I can just paint around and not worry about it later. You can add this in using a gel coat pen, but I had left my gel coat pen on my boat where I'm actually currently editing this and didn't have it with me. A love-hate relationship with masking fluid. It always goes on kind of clumpy. It's a bit of a pain to work with, but it does the job well. You can also use a piece of wax if you like to mask it out, but it's very hard as well to get that accurate and get the lines right. So here I'm using it. I'm kind of brushing in the highlight areas along the feather. You can see it here in the reference picture. Now, you'll also know that my painting is turned upside down because that's kind of how I always see nuthatches. They're always walking down a tree, like they're never, sitting on a branch like this one is in the reference photo. So please forgive the disorientation of the reference photo. I just decided that I think this nuthatch should be like all the other nuthatches in proper nuthatch form, as nutty as that may sound. And now, as we all know, one of the key ingredients to watercolor painting is water. So I'm going to take some water here and I stick my fingers, grab it out, and just sort of dab it on, pre-wet my paints so that they are just like they are when they come out of the tube. The difference between paints on your pan that have dried and paints in the tube that have not dried is that the paints in the tube have water. That's what evaporates from your paint when you're making a watercolor painting. I always leave my paints on the palette. I never have a problem, and I get lots and lots of pigment and saturated colors out of them. Now we need to mix up a nice deep dark color for that eyeball. So in here I've got some burnt umber and some indigo, two of my go-to make a black colors. They make a nice deep rich black. If you want to cool it off a bit, you can add in some quinacridone magenta or any cool or cool red for that matter. It doesn't matter, showing you here on a piece of test paper what it looks like. Now we're going to put it on the eye. Now I want a little bit of gradation in here. I want it to go from a dark black to the lighter brown color that you see underneath. And to do that, we're going to paint what's called wet on wet, which means we're going to put wet paint on wet paper. This allows the pigments to bleed into each other and not just go on as dry, sort of sticky paste. I go back and forth between this technique and just putting on pigment, depending on what I'm doing. So you'll see now I've got the black on that I made, and I'm putting in some quinacridone gold. You could also use burnt sienna or something like that to get a reddy orange brown color. And now because that paper is wet, those two pigments are going to bleed into each other. So we're going to continue on with the wet on wet technique in this painting. For that, I'm going to use a Kolinsky Sable hairbrush. You can use a synthetic brush if you like. You just want to make sure that it holds a decent amount of water. Squirrel hair brushes are good for this. Kolinsky Sable is weasel hair from Kolinsky somewhere in Russia. I believe it's the furthest north that weasels can grow, and it makes their hair longer because it's colder or something like that. So in case you are wondering, yes, I do believe weasels were harmed in the making of this painting. Here we're going to put on some water first, just like we did with the eyeball. You'll notice there's nothing coming out of my brush. It's not broken. It means I'm just putting clean water on. Once I have that on, I'm going to add in the pigments and they will bleed out. So I have to come clean here. I accidentally dabbed the brown of the eyeball, and you can see that quinacridone gold is leaking through. I'm going to have to clean that up. And in doing so, I actually lifted some of the pigment out of the eye, which I will have to put back down later. Oh well, these things happen. We will just carry on. Now I'm going to put in some of the phthalo blue here. I've got phthalo blue red shade, and I'm putting that along where I've already put the water on the painting, and you can see now it's going to start to bleed out. You can see those pigments bleeding down. Because we have the masking fluid in there, we can be a little careless or loose with our painting and put lots of water and pigment on because those lines are already there. Now I'm going to dry off my brush a little bit, and get some of this feather to a dry brush across where I want the tail to end. So basically, I've taken off some of the pigment and then I can dry brush it so it's not as wet. And I'm going to add in using some of the brownish black that we made for the eyeball. I'm going to use that for some of the shadow areas down here. Now I'm just switching to my smaller brush here to get just a bit more control over the pigment. I usually use one or two brushes, and sorry, two or three brushes anyways, just so that one I can have for one color, one I can have for water, one I can for adding in pigment when I'm doing this type of painting style. So now I'm going to use my larger brush again and put some clean water on, and this way I can bleed some of those pigments out a bit more and just keep the paper wet when I add in some of the darker areas. Going to switch to my smaller brush here to add in some finer lines and details, as well as get back to fixing that eyeball. And remember, we are adding clean water, and then we're dabbing the pigment into it to make it bleed around. Back to eyeball 2.0, we're adding in the dark color that we mixed, and then I'm going to bleed some quinacridone gold into the bottom of it, and you'll see those colors will bleed together. That masking fluid is still in there, so once it won't really show at this stage in the painting. It's hard to see, but it is still there, and we'll take it out afterwards. Now look along here, along the edge here where we see this dried pigment. We're going to take some clean water and we're going to pick up some of that pigment. Just like you can take dried paints off of your palette, you can also use them on your painting once they're dried. So up here, I'm going to grab this, some of this blue, and I just want this to bleed in down below. And now I'm going to grab some quinacridone gold from my palette and put in some of those areas underneath the wing. I'm going to take a little bit of creative freedom with this and make it a lot more saturated than it is in the original picture because I think it looks good and it's my bird. I can do what I want. If we look at the white area in the chest of the bird, you'll see that there's lots of different colors. It's not actually just a solid block of white, but they're very subtle as well. So to keep them subtle, we're going to use the existing paint on the painting and pull it down with clean water. I'm going to get even crazier with that quinacridone gold and add in some more saturated pigment and let it bleed into those wet areas. Here I'm exercising a bit of creative freedom and throwing a little bit of quinacridone magenta into the mix just for the fun of it. It helps define the shadow areas and break up some of that bland, dull on the chest. Now we're going to add some shadows on the belly, and to do that, we are going to grab some of our burnt umber and indigo mix, focusing a little bit more on the brown side, and dab it into that water along there. And again, we're going to let it bleed. Okay, now we're going to mix up some phthalo blue and indigo, and a relatively dry mix. You can see there on the test paper how it goes on. It kind of scrapes across the paper. Here you can see it in action on the real painting. I'm going to leave some space in between these little feather areas so that the lighter lines show through. This is where the painting really starts to come together when you have this sort of second layer over top of the first one. And just as I did before, I'm going to use some clean water, pick up that existing pigment that I just put down, and I'm going to use it to fill in some of the areas on top of the wing. And now we're going to pick up some of that dark color. Again, same color we've been using all along, the one in the eyeballs and everything else, and we're going to start to define some of those shadow areas. Next, we're going to take a little bit of very watered down buff titanium and put it in some of the areas around the head, just to put something there so it's not pure white. And I think we need a bit more value along the top here. So I'm going to put in some clean water and then dab in some of the blue-black color. And now that we have those midtones sorted out, we can move on to the very dark values. We've got our indigo mixed with burnt umber here, and we're putting it under the shadow, under the wing, and in some of the feathers at the back. And I'm not a fan of overworking my paintings, but one thing I am guilty of, and I'm sure a lot of people encounter this, is once you start putting on those darker values, then all of a sudden the midtones or lighter areas can often seem too light. So then you got to go back and darken them up to make it more balanced and look realistic. Now we're going to take our trusty number one sable hair brush and we're going to use some indigo with not a lot of water, trying to keep it as saturated as possible to put some of the details in around the eye. You'll notice I'm going very slow here, and that is because I am kind of keeping my head out of the view of the camera, but still trying to see what I'm doing. And this is a critical step. What I often recommend to beginners is do the eyes first. Do that the very first part. If you mess it up and you think, you know what, I ruined this, well, then you can start over and you haven't gotten all this far into it yet. Until you're confident and you know how your paint's going to dry and everything else, it's a good idea to, do these detailed parts first. Get them out of the way, make sure they're done correctly, and that way, if you do want to start over, you don't have all this time invested. Now we're going to use some clean water to bleed out some of that indigo mix that we just put down and put our first layer onto the beak. As well, we're going to dab in a little bit of quinacridone gold underneath. And I put this quinacridone gold on a bit strong, so I've diluted it with some water here. Next, we're going to add some definition to the head. I put some clean water down here, and I'm just dabbing in some of that blue mixture again. I'm going to dilute it with some water, make it spread out a little bit. And the reason we want to spread it out, is to dilute it, is to make a gradient. There's actually no real lines in nature. It's just different values of shadows and light. Once that beak is dry from where we put the water on before, we're going to take some of the blue mixture and add some more definition to it, putting a layer on top. Hey, comment on my last video said this bird needs feet, so let's paint some feet. We've got a raw sienna mixture here, and I'm just kind of outlining them, keeping it pretty diluted, and then we'll come back in and put the shadow on the edge. Try not to overthink this part. Basically, you're just making the shape of the feet with one layer, and then you're adding in the shadow where the dark areas are in the next. So it's basically just two very simple layers. Now, it would be pretty nutty if our nuthatch wasn't standing on something and his feet were just hanging there like this. So we're going to put a bunch of water on to make our branch. This is just some clean water that we're putting on. I'm being careful around the feet because I didn't let them dry. If you're not so accurate with your brush, you might want to just wait until your feet are dry, or else they're going to bleed into the branch, which is a very similar color already. Speaking of color, we're going to grab some burnt umber and mix it in with our raw sienna for the branch. And we're going to apply it into the wet area on the paper that we just made. Try not to overthink it. Be as accurate as you can. Don't wreck your bird, but don't put too much stress into how this branch looks. I think the most important part here for the branch is to keep the values accurate, have the shadows where there should be shadows. Feel free to throw in some other colors like some magenta, some green, some yellows. Now, of course, there's going to be some shadows on the bird too, not just on the branch. So I'm just going to use some clean water and pull some of that pigment up. But I will have diluted it a bit too much, so I'm going to add in some more pigment to bring that value up underneath again. While we're waiting for the branch to dry, let's put in some details around the beak. There is a little line that separates where the beak opens and closes. We're going to add that in. As well, we're going to add in some of the phthalo blue along the back feathers there just to give them a tiny bit of definition. Okay, now we're in the home stretch. We're going to add in some more dark values just to bring up the shadow areas and add in a few little details and then remove the masking fluid. To remove the masking fluid, just first make sure that the paint around it is dry, and then you're just going to gently rub your finger over it and it'll peel off the paper. Once you get the masking fluid off, take a step back, look at your painting, and see if you need any more details like shadow areas or areas around the eye, things like that, that become more apparent now that you've got that contrast without the masking fluid. Once that's done, it's a wrap. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed.